For those of you I haven't met yet, my name is Stephen. I'm on staff here. I'm relatively new. I've only been here for 4 months, so still getting to know many of you. It's a great honor every time you're given the privilege of being able to preach from God's Word. And so we're in a series in 2 Samuel, and I've been tasked with these two chapters, 2 Samuel 5 and 6. Now, because of the death of Pope Francis, I've been getting a lot of questions because I teach at a seminary and I train other pastors. So they're saying, hey, how are we supposed to kind of engage this discussion when people ask the differences between Romanism or Catholicism and what we believe as Protestants, gospel-believing Protestants. And so this has introduced many discussions about angelology, right? Like questions about angels and some of the doctrinal distinctions, and also about Marian theology. That is why Catholics venerate Mary. And you have to be careful with the language because a lot of Protestants will say, oh, you worship Mary. No, they make a very clear distinction between dulia and latria, right? These are Latin terms. Latria is worship to God alone, and dulia is venerating or honoring or respecting the saints, and of course, hyperdulia for the mother of Jesus. Just to be fair, we have to make sure we represent them well. So you start wondering, what is that all about? Why are people fascinated by these other saints and people like Mary and angels? And one person responded this way. The fascination is because we're able to get all the comfort of a divine reality without any of the demands. That is to say, that we want to relate to divine things without being traumatized by the holiness of that divine person. I believe that it's a way that we try to manage God. It's a way of domesticating God. As we know from the early church to the patristic period and to the medieval church and ultimately to the Reformation, that there was a view of God where people understood him to be holy, to be sovereign, and to be majestic. But of course, within our modern age, God has become benign and docile and tame. But we're going to be confronted very, very quickly here from 2 Samuel chapter 6 that God is anything. He's not even close to being tame. He's actually appears to be very, very dangerous. There is an episode in C.S. Lewis's Narnia Chronicles. There are multiple books, and in the first book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, there are these talking animals, talking beavers, Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and they are talking with the children. And Mrs. Beaver makes this great insight about Aslan, who is the Christ figure, the messianic figure, who is a lion, who represents Jesus. And this is what she says. She says, if there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just plain silly. And of course, one of the children, very, very insightful, perceptive, and curious child, her name was Lucy, and she asked the question, is Aslan safe? And Mr. Beaver responded to her with these famous words, safe? I said nothing about safe, but he is good. And so what we're going to find here in this passage is that the God of the Bible, the true God of the Bible, the holy God of the Bible, is not safe. He's not tame. He is holy, but he is good. He's the king, I tell you, as they said. So as we look at the life of David here, and as we consider what was the gospel according to David, I want us to consider it in these three ways. First is the kingly reign of a delegated authority. Second is the awful mystery of a holy God. And thirdly, the sweet awareness of a redeemed sinner. And And as Paul Ricoeur, the famous French philosopher, has said, that oftentimes we go through different experiences through constant cycles of orientation that typifies what we consider to be balance and equilibrium in our lives, to disorientation when sin interrupts that, and then a reorientation or a new orientation. And so that's kind of the cycle that we're going to be looking at here. So let's look first at the kingly reign of a delegated authority. Let's look in chapter 5, verses 1 and following. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh." So here, again, this is kind of very intimate husband-wife language, bone and flesh. "In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel." And that's reminiscent of the Mosaic period with the Exodus, how God led his people out of and brought them out of bondage. And the Lord said to you, "You shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord. And they anointed David king over Israel, and David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem he reigned over all of Israel and Judah for 33 years. So what we find here with David is he is the successor of the first king of Israel. His name was Saul. But what distinguishes his monarchy, his kingship, and the kingship of David is that David clearly understood that his authority and his kingship was delegated. It was derived. It was empowered. It was a subordinate service, that it was secondary, derivative, penultimate, not ultimate. David ultimately knew that God is the king. That he is saying, yep, there's a new king. Saul's no longer king. The household of Saul is gone. A new king has arrived. And the name of that new king is Yahweh. So David understood that even though he was king, he was the earthly king, and he was reigning over Israel, all of Israel, for 40 years, considered the greatest king in Israelite history. But he understood that his rule and reign was delegated. It was derived. It was something that was received. It says here that he was anointed. You know, this is one of the things, and you can call me an older guy. I'm more of a traditionalist when it comes to athletics and all that. And anyway, so I used to watch athletes in the 80s and 90s where they would, like, if they're playing football, American football that is, and they got a touchdown, they just put the ball down and they walk away, or they give it to the referee. Now we've got all this kind of extracurricular activity. I don't know what that's about. Or there's a guy who's 6'9", 240 pounds, an amazing athlete, and he dunks the ball. How hard is that for a 6'9", 240, right? And what is he walking away doing this, you know, like, what is it? So I guess it's like he's trying to crown himself. You can't crown yourself. It is something that is done to you. It is something that is received. Someone has to anoint you. You can't anoint yourself. Have you ever seen a monarch where you watch the British monarchy? You saw Prince Charles become King Charles. Did you see him going up there and taking it and crowning himself? No, somebody crowned you. And David understood that the authority that he had received was penultimate. It was derivative. It was borrowed. Let me just kind of say this for a moment. Friends, even though we try to rule our own lives, we try, but deep inside there's this gnawing suspicion that we're not quite up to the job. We tend to think that we are over-competent or uber-competent to run our own lives. We're not. As a matter of fact, we're not even completely competent to ruin our own lives either. Although we can, make some stupid decisions and complicate things, but ultimately we can't ruin it. If you're a child of God, ultimately you can't sustain that or hold on to that, because it is something that is inherited. It is given to you. We are considered kings and priests. We are a kingdom and a priesthood, as Revelation 1 says, and also Peter. And so where do we see this? Well, we saw this in verse 3. He's anointed. Let's look here in verse 10. It says here, and David became greater and greater. So that means that his kingship was ascending. He was gaining greater power and greater recognition and respect from the neighboring nations. And what is the reason for that? Here's the next phrase. For the Lord, the God of hosts, was with him. So David clearly knew the reason why I am increasing and gaining greater stature and greater authority and power is because it's derived. It comes from someone else. He is the one who is pouring that authority and power in me because I have been anointed by someone else. The real king is God. I'm just a servant king. We also see this in verse 12. It says here, and David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he had exalted the kingdom for the sake of the people of Israel. Not for David's sake, but for the sake of God's people. See, everything is in the passive tense, that he was exalted, that he was anointed, that he was established by the Lord God Almighty. If that were not enough, look here in verse 19. It says here in David, as he's going into battle against the Philistines, they were the enemies of God and enemies of David. And in verse 19, and David inquired of the Lord. Wait a minute, David, you're the king. Well, who are you inquiring to? I mean, people come to you. You're the king. What you say is law. But David knew that even though he is the king, that he's going to inquire of the Lord. And shall I go up against the Philistines? Will you give them into my hand? And the Lord said to David, go up for, what does he say? God says, I will certainly give the Philistines into your hands, not you. But then the narrator says in verse 30, David defeated them there. But then David says, the Lord has burst through my enemies before me like a bursting flood, this kind of overpowering current of water that's just coming and bringing about destruction. And then in verse 21, and the Philistines left their idols there. That's interesting, because earlier on we see that the Israelites, when they went into battle, that the Philistines captured their ark, right, which was a symbol of the majesty and the holiness of God. And this time, the Philistines left their gods. And David and his men carried them away, lest you think that they were falling into idolatry at this point because they were curious and they brought their own gods. But there's a parallel passage in 1 Chronicles 14:12 which says David had them burned. Okay, just to be very clear, they didn't take them in order to worship them, but to burn them. And then it says in verse 23, and then David, again, they're going to battle with the Philistines second time in the valley of Rephaim. And he says, and when David inquired of the Lord, he said, you shall not go up. Go around to their rear and come against them opposite the balsam trees. And when you hear the sound of marching in the tops of the balsam trees, it's kind of reminiscent of the two towers in Tolkien. But anyways, it says here, then rouse yourself, for then the Lord has gone out before you to strike down the army of the Philistines. And David did as the Lord commanded, and he struck them down. So at every instance, David understood that unlike Saul, that his authority was something that was derived. You know, here is the temptation that we all have, that we want to reject God's rule in favor of our own self-rule. We want to follow the sovereign self, even though we know that we're not quite up to the job. And so what we see in Saul, what we see with Abner, the commander of Saul's army, then what we see in Joab, who's the commander of David's army, who kills Abner. I mean, this is the reason why. You know, people are very intrigued about the life of David, and you know, they can make a story about it, and people want to watch this because, I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I mean, someone's getting beheaded, and there's a lot of killing, there's betrayal, and this is real history. But what we find here is that David does not celebrate the removal of his rivals. When other people will kill these other people, like killed Saul's son Ishbosheth, and comes and says, hey, you know, here we go, here's the head of Ishbosheth, and David has him killed. Why? Because I'm not going to delight in the fact that you removed my rival. You touched someone who was a king. You're not supposed to do that. Now, for some of you who are grammarians, you might appreciate this analogy. In a sentence structure, there's a subject and a verb. So if you have a subject and a verb, then that's a sentence. It's a complete statement, even if you don't have a direct object or indirect object or a prepositional phrase or anything like that. So a subject and a verb. And then when you have another sentence after that sentence and you use pronouns, the pronouns always refer back. Remember this? Refer back to the subject, the aforementioned subject. So we call that the antecedent or the referent. The pronoun is not the main role, it's a supporting role to the main actor, which is the subject. And David knew he was only a pronoun, right? He knew that the main subject was God himself. He was only referring back. He was referring back. He's like, because the only authority that I have, it has been received and given to me by God. You know, when I look here about the history of the ark, look here in chapter 6, verses 1 and 2. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baale, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. 30,000? Really, David? You don't assemble that many men unless you're going into battle. Did he really think that he was going to get attacked as they are transporting several miles from Kiriath Jearim, which is the other word for Baale, Judah, to Jerusalem? Really, David? You thought that you were going to get attacked, so you have to prepare an army of 30,000 men? No. David didn't think that was going to happen. David is creating a parade. This is a procession. This is a triumphal kind of entry, and he wants to make a point about what's happening as they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant, which was the symbol of the majesty and the holiness of God, which had been kind of left for a long period of time. It was not part of Saul's dynasty at all. And here's a brief history on this. The Ark of the Covenant was in Shiloh. So the Ark of the Covenant is a small chest. It's actually not very impressive at all. It's impressive because God's presence resides there. But the Ark of the Covenant is about 3¼ feet by 2¼ by 2¼ right? So it's like a rectangular box. And it was made out of acacia wood, and it was overlaid with gold inside and outside, and there was a cover that you placed on top of the ark, and that was made of complete gold. And there were these cherubim that were carved out, and with their angels like this, with their heads down, because that was the place where God would meet his people. Okay, that was the throne room of God. God sits on his throne on top of, and we call that the mercy seat, which is the cover over the Ark of the Covenant. Anyways, that was in Shiloh for 300 plus years. And then, what ended up happening was when Eli, the priest, had a couple of evil sons. Their names were Hophni and Phinehas, right? And so they decided when they were going to battle with the Philistines, they said, hey, we need to win this battle. And we know that when others in the past had brought the Ark of the Covenant into battle, they were victorious. So when they were crossing, Joshua was crossing the Jordan River, they would bring the Ark of the Covenant, and God would part the river, and they'd be able to walk on dry land. Or when they were attacking the city of Jericho, and they were going around the wall of the city of Jericho once a day, and they would bring the Ark of the Covenant, and they would go around the wall, and on the seventh day, the walls collapsed. By the way, collapsed outwardly, not inwardly, just to show you that archaeologically it actually happened. And then, so these guys are thinking, all right, hey, we're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant. We've got to bring it so that we'll have a victory over the Philistines. However, their problem was that they were bringing it like it was a genie kind of, what do you call it, genie bottle or like a magical box. They had a kind of a superstitious view. Okay, just bring it out, just prop it up, and God will do his thing, and we'll be victorious. And so they went, and guess what happened? Did they win? No, of course not. They lost the battle. And to make things worse, the Ark of the Covenant was captured by the Philistines in Aphek. And so it started to circulate within the 4 different Philistine cities, Aphek, and then it went to Ashdod. And then because, whenever the ark was there, people were in terror because they sensed the presence of God and the power of God. And then they moved it to Ashdod and put it in the temple of Dagon, their pagan god. So there's a statue of Dagon, and they put the ark in front of it. And they come back the next day, and the statue of Dagon had fallen with a face down towards the ark. They said, "What is this?" And so they prop the statue back up, and then the next day, same thing happens, but the head is off and the arms are off. And so this God here, represented by the ark, is powerful. We don't want to have anything to do with it. So they gave it to another neighboring city called Gath. And then there they had issues, so they sent it off to Ekron. And Ekron, there were all sorts of tumors. And finally, they get the point, and they're like, this ark, this God of the Israelites, he's too much to handle. He's too holy. So let's give the ark back to the people. They come up with this great plan in 1 Samuel 5, I think it is, and they put it on a new cart, and they bring it over, and they go to Beth Shemesh, and I think it was there only for I don't know how many months. And then finally, they settled in bringing it to Kiriath Jearim, which is Bailey, Judah, here in our passage, for 20 years. And so the Ark of the Covenant was never around when Saul was king. That should tell you something about his reign. But David says, no. My authority is derived, this delegated. I'm not in charge here. God is. And so in order for me to show the entire people of Israel who is the real king, we're going to have this procession, and we're going to bring the Ark of the Covenant, and we're going to bring it in, and we're going to inaugurate this triumphal celebration that God is king. But the problem was, David had not advised or consulted like he did Uriel. He didn't inquire, or he should have been more aware of the history of how you're supposed to handle the Ark of the Covenant. So what did they do? They put it on a new cart. Well, where did they get that idea? Well, they were copying the Philistines. That's exactly what they did. It's like, hey, come on, this wasn't a used vehicle. This is a new cart. Okay? I mean, come on, they were trying to be mindful, but here's the problem. And here is the major sin of Uzzah as we think about the awful mystery of a holy God. This is what we're going to talk about. Here's the major issue with Uzzah here. And let's look at this in verses 3 and following. And it says, and they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill, in Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark. And David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it, for the oxen stumbled. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God. Okay. Some of you are sitting there and saying, this is why I don't like Christianity. What kind of a God is this? Now, let me say for those of you who profess faith in Christ, if this is not like shocking, or if you're just sitting there and say, okay, let's get to the next verse, you're not listening carefully. See, people look at this and they say, what a capricious, arbitrary, whimsical, like willy-nilly, he got angry. Somebody broke the rule, and he got angry and just struck him dead right at that moment. I don't want to believe in a God like that. I thought the God of the Bible was a God of grace. Okay? I understand the tension. And I'm not going to try to explain that. There have been many people and commentators and ministers who have tried to explain this away. And saying, oh, this was a narrative that was created. This is not how it actually happened. No, this is exactly how it happened. I'm not going to make excuses for God like he needs to be excused in any way. But what is going on here is that there is a serious problem. We all have a serious problem, okay, whether you're a Christian or not. And that is that we are prone to wander, that we have a desire to live our lives our own ways and not according to the ways of God. And the problem here that Uzzah had was that he was not aware of his sinful condition. He was not aware of his predicament. Now again, just to be fair, let's explain what's going on here, because I think many people have misunderstood this over the years. And by the way, a lot of the insights that I get on this point, I get from one of my kind of mentors. I didn't have a personal relationship with him, but was shaped by a lot of his writings. Is a person, theologian, public theologian by the name of R.C. Sproul. He wrote a book called The Holiness of God, and he describes it this way. You know, it seems as though Uzzah is just kind of instinctively responding. And he is kind of, it's not premeditated, it is kind of reflexive. They put it on a cart, and by the way, you don't steer a cart, there's never a driver's seat in a cart, right? The oxen just kind of pull it. And so they were going over some kind of patch of whatever, dirt, and you know, and then the cart stumbled, and you saw the ark about to fall, and Uzzah was just kind of reaching out to save it because he doesn't want it to get soiled by the dirt. I mean, shouldn't he be receiving a voice from heaven that says, Uzzah, hey, good catch, thanks, good job, right? You're a Kohathite who comes from the tribe of Levi. You were told very early on that your service was to care for all of the holy furnishings, or especially there's nothing more holy than the Ark of the Covenant from the temple or the tabernacle, and you're supposed to transport that, you know. So you were watching, you weren't goofing around, just kind of singing and not paying attention, but you did that. No. At that very moment, he died. Now, what was Uzzah's sin? The three things that happened here, which might not be obvious. Number one, they copied pagan practices by putting the ark on the cart. You never transport the Ark of the Covenant on a cart. They were told, the Kohathites, who are part of the tribe of Levi, their one purpose and role was to transport the holy furnishing and like the Ark of the Covenant. They all knew that you never put it on a cart, because what happened was there were, on this chest, there were these 4 gold rings. And then you would put these poles made out of acacia wood, overlaid with gold, and you put the 2 poles in there, and then the Kohathites, the Levites, would hold on to it and transport it this way. You're supposed to carry it on your shoulder. You never put it on a cart, but that's what they did. Problem number 1. Problem number 2. In Numbers chapter 4, it was told that a veil is supposed to cover the ark, because it's not only a capital offense to touch the ark, but to actually gaze upon and look at the ark, because God, ark, you can look at at the ark, because God is holy and you can't gaze upon his holiness, so they have to cover it. There was no covering here. It's just on the cart, albeit a new cart. Problem number 3. Uzzah touched it. Uzzah touched it. What is the problem here? The problem is that Uzzah, and this is the problem that we all have, is that we actually think that our hand is cleaner than the dirt. See, Uzzah failed to realize, that's what Sproul says. He says, Uzzah thought that his hand was cleaner than the dirt. He thought that, the dirt will kind of soil the Ark of the Covenant, but my hand will not. That was a false assumption that he made. Why? Because the soil, the dirt, is just being what it's supposed to be. God created the dirt was being dirt. It was obeying its role in being a dirt. But Uzzah thought that he was cleaner than he actually was. He lost sight of the fact that what he had been taught all throughout his years, God is holy, and we cannot approach his holiness. And therefore, we need to be careful how we relate to him. You know what? Out of his arrogance, his irreverent act, he just says, no big deal. I'm going to reach it out with my hand. Now, this is, again, at this point where you're going to say, can you explain this a little bit better to me? I don't understand. And I do empathize with those of you who are not professing Christians, and you're here. And here's the apologetic. Okay? We all have a moral ecology. In other words, we all have a moral framework. We all do, whether you're a Christian or a skeptic or somebody who's exploring. We all have a moral framework, or what we call a moral ecology, what philosophers call a moral cosmology. We all have a set of virtues, set of values that we believe are good for human flourishing and for my own life. And so if we live according to that, we believe that we're going to be happy and we're going to enjoy life. And we don't like it when others, especially from the other tribe, our opponents, the people in the other tribe, right? The others, right? We all have that. You know who they are in your life. When they break my virtues or my values and they don't agree with me on some sort of particular social issue, then what happens? We say, oh, now you're blaspheming my worldview. And you're going to have to be accountable for that. And so what do? We come up with a verdict, or we cancel them, and then we sentence them to social hell. And then we don't want to have anything to do with them. We alienate them. We isolate them, however we do this. Now, everyone does this, by the way. Doesn't matter whether you're on the left or the right ideologically. This is what we do. This is not healthy, but this is what we do. Let me say it another way to kind of reinforce this thought. If I were to name 3 evil things right now, whether you're a Christian or not, we'll all be in agreement. Doesn't matter what your moral ecology is, we would all be in agreement. Yep, that's evil, that's sinful. Here it goes. Rape. There you go. There's no one in this room who's going to justify that rape is a good thing. That's evil, that's sinful. So we all agree on that. Number 2, pederasty. That would be like pedophilia. That would be sexually abusing a minor. That's horrendous. Right? And so we all know that's terrible. Or the third one would be racism. So we're all in agreement on these things. And they're evil, sinful, terrible things. That does not promote human flourishing. That does not respect human beings who have been created in the image of God, regardless of where you are in your ideological camp. Doesn't matter whether you're Christian or not. So we're all in agreement about that. And so when we see those sorts of injustices, what's going on in your mind? You're thinking, that deserves judgment. We can't just let that person walk away. That person deserves judgment, whatever the full extent of the law or rejection or cancellation. That person deserves it. People are less than human, and we ought not to do that. Now, I'm not going to get into a whole sidetrack about forgiveness and all that, right? You can listen to a podcast we've done on that. But if that's the case, we all have a moral impulse, even for skeptics, that there are certain things that we all consider to be unjust, and we want there to be judgment and justice in the midst of that injustice, then why would you expect anything less from God? If indeed he exists, and I understand we might not be in agreement on that, but if you believe that he does exist, there is a supreme being, and he is if he's worthy to be believed and worthy to trust, then you would expect him to be just, not unjust. You would expect him to judge injustice, not just to overlook it. Why would you want to believe? I don't want to believe in a God like that. I don't want to believe in a God who's not holy. I don't want to believe in a God who doesn't judge. And the problem here, as Sproul goes on to say, we are shocked by justice because we assume grace. We should never assume grace, my friends. A holy God is not obligated to be merciful to anyone. I know people don't like to hear that. They're like, are you kidding me? That's what a God's supposed to do. That's his job. No, God is holy. He's set apart. He is just. God does not know how to be unjust. Now, he can be merciful and gracious, and thankfully he is. But let's not negotiate his holiness while we're trying to do that. There's a classic illustration that Sproul uses, and I understand this as somebody who teaches in a divinity faculty. He was teaching a Bible or theology in one of his classes, actually near here, locally, somewhere, many years ago. And he came into the class early on after Labor Day and told them, hey, no tests. They're like, yes, great, no tests. But there'll be 3 papers. One will be due September 30th, second one October 30th, third one November 30th. They're like, okay, no big deal. Not a long paper, 5, 6 pages. But I'm telling you, you have to submit your papers on time. If you don't, you will get an F. They're like, hey, no problem. Yeah, we got plenty of time. So September 30th rolls around. 225 out of 250 students come forward and they submit the exams, right? This was before the internet, right? They couldn't do it online. And then 25 of them are back in the, they're petrified and be like, oh no, what do we do? And say, oh, Professor Sproul, we didn't make a good transition from adolescence to college, we're also first-year students. Please help us. We're not good with time management. Give us a few days of extension. And what did he say? He said, all right, I'll give you 2-3 day extension. And, but hey, don't forget, make sure in the next paper you submit it on time. No, October 30th rolls around. 200 out of 250 students submit their papers in on time. And then there are 50 in the back. They don't have their papers. They're not petrified, but they're nervous. And they said, hey, Professor Sproul, there was like a big event on campus. We didn't manage our time well. Please, can you be gracious? And he says, all right, I'll give you an extension, a few days. And then what happened? He became the most popular professor on campus. We love you, Professor Sproul. He's so flexible and all that, until November 30th. November 30th, 150 out of 250 students submit their papers on time. And the other 100, they're just kind of walking out. They're just like kind of talking with their friends. And they say, oh, wait a minute. Henderson, do you have your paper? Oh, don't worry about it, Professor. I'll give it to you in a few days. F. And then all of a sudden you hear some murmuring and be like, hey, what was that? Was that you, Mosley? Do you have your paper? No, sir. F for you. And then what happened? What was the chorus that was coming from the gallery at that time? It's unfair. Hey, did I just hear you say that? Yes, sir. Do you have your paper? No, sir. F for you. Oh, by the way, if I recall, on October 30th, you submitted your paper late as well. Yes, sir. F for that too. Now, you hear something like that and you're like, oh my goodness. And by the way, I've never had courage to do that with my students. And I'm still debating whether I should consider doing it at some point. But I always say, okay, I give you a 2-day extension. And maybe I just want to be loved more. But you see, God's normal activity is to always be merciful. But once we start expecting it, then demanding it, then when he doesn't provide it, then we say it's unfair. We put him on the dock. We put him as the object of the recipient of our judgment over God. When God is ultimately holy. He's not obligated, my dear friends, as a holy God to be gracious to us, although he is absolutely and amazingly gracious. We don't deserve his grace. But he does not owe us grace. What we deserve, if we want to talk about like as typical kind of self-centered Western Americans, we're entitled people, right? We're just always like entitled. And we know this, right? Don't get touchy on me, but we all know this. Right? We go anywhere else in the world and everyone's like, oh, you American entitled person. That to a certain extent, that's true. And we demand these things. We don't appreciate when we receive grace. So when holiness shows up, we're shocked. Uzzah had no awareness of the seriousness of his sin. But deep inside, I think what he needed to learn was, and this was the principle that he needed to learn, that it wasn't ultimately going to be based upon what you can do to offer and thinking that you are actually better or more righteous than you actually are, and therefore you're willing to put out your hand and not have this kind of fear for the holiness of God. I believe that deep inside every single one of us, whether or not you're a Christian or not, that we all know that we're not quite good enough. We're not enough. You're saying, no, I feel like I'm enough. Well, let me show you. If you think that you're enough or good enough or competent enough or skilled enough or righteous enough or however you want to describe yourself, then why do you strive so much? Why do you try to prove what are you trying to prove? See, if you know that you're fully competently righteous and good enough, then you should be at complete peace. You should be the most restful person. But why are you so restless? The reason why your restlessness is proof that you know deep inside there's a gnawing suspicion, I got to show people that I'm actually better than I actually am. Even the whole baseline cultural narrative of be true to yourself. Think about that. The reason why that's the baseline cultural narrative is because you don't believe that you're truly true to yourself. That there's a false version of you, and so you want to evolve into a truer version of you. You're not quite there on the journey, and what are you doing? You're trying everything that you can through your competency, your skill, or religious righteousness in order to procure that and to achieve that, but deep inside you know you're not getting close. That's how I know. The Bible doesn't have to say this. Sociologically, experientially, you know that you're not righteous enough. And Uzzah failed to understand this. One Christian author, Paul Tripp, says, Scriptures remind us that God rescues you and me from you and me. The ultimate, biggest problem in your life is not outside of you, it's inside of you. I know it's hard to understand. I can already hear my interlocutors who are disagreeing with me, I know. But the primary issue in your life is not the occasion or the circumstance around you, but it's what's inside of you, what's inside of me. Okay? Again, I try to show you that we have an intuition, we have an awareness that these things are. We have an impulse to know that we are being haunted by the ghosts of reality, telling us, yeah, you know you don't quite measure up. You know you're not good enough. But you're striving. You're trying really hard. You're trying to curate your social media. Yeah, how's that working out for you? You still walk away being utterly insecure and afraid and anxious and afraid and restless and bitter because you are envious of somebody who's curating their fake lives better than you. So the awful mystery of a holy God. And lastly, and here's the hope, the sweet awareness of a redeemed sinner. The sweet awareness of a redeemed sinner. Let's look here in verses 9 and following. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, how can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David, that would be Jerusalem. But David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months. And the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. Verse 13. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with sound of the horn. What's going on here? It's simple. He asked the question, how can the ark of the Lord, ark of God, come to me? If God is so holy, and that holy vessel is the throne room of God, that's where the presence of God is, and it's symbolic of that, then how can I draw close to a holy God like that? Is there any hope? Is there any hope for us? And David came to an awareness, and the narrative doesn't say, but he came to his senses. He had some glimmer of hope of something in the future. He understood the system, and he realized, we need a sacrifice. See, we just kind of went in there. We need to understand, in order for us to get close to God, there needs to be a sacrifice. There needs to be a burnt offering. And what happens is when there's a burnt offering, you kill an animal, sacrifice an animal, and you put the blood on top of the Ark of the Covenant, the mercy seat. You sprinkle it 7 times. They did once a year, Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, Yom Kippur. What that was showing the people was, that animal is taking my place. The slaughter and the sacrifice and the blood shed, that should be me. The judgment that animal is receiving is in my place. And so at that very moment, you realize that God is willing to provide provision. He's willing to give you redemption. He's willing to say that at the cross, the grace of God broke out through the work of Jesus, bursted out, just like it says Perez Uzzah. Perez just simply means, or Perezim, the plural, it just simply means the bursting out of the judgment of God. But now what we have as followers of Jesus Christ is Perez, Jesus. The judgment of God fell on Jesus. That he was the substitute and the sacrifice in our place. His blood for my blood, his place for me. And so if that is the case, as one author puts it, Holiness requires sin to be dealt with, and grace demanded a sacrifice to be made, and Jesus made that sacrifice. A Christian author by the name of Dane Ortlund, in one of his books, says that in the Old Testament, this is what it says: the Old Testament temple repelled those things that were unclean and unholy. And the New Testament temple attracted those who were unclean and unholy. Because in Haggai chapter 2, verse 13, it says, if someone who is unclean comes into contact with a dead body, then will that person also be considered unclean? And the priest come forward and say, yup, that person will be unclean. But what happens in Mark chapter 1, when a leper who is considered ceremonially unclean comes to Jesus and says, well, if you heal me, then I know I will be well. And what does Jesus do? He reaches out. He is holy, righteous, rabbi, the Son of God. He reaches out and touches somebody who is ceremonially unclean and heals him. And then he gets delivered from his leprosy. And this is what Ortlund goes on to say. He says, in the Old Testament, clean plus unclean equals unclean. But in the New Testament, clean plus unclean equals clean. Because in the Old Testament, uncleanness is contagious, but in the New Testament, holiness is contagious. Because of what Christ accomplished for us, and because he's the utter, holy, set-apart one, sacrifice once and for all, as the writer of Hebrews says, so we don't need another lamb, we don't need another sacrifice. He has done it once and for all, perfected, Hebrews 9, 10, and 12. So we have the confidence to go into the throne of grace because we know that somebody else has come and stood in our place, and we know that we are covered like the mercy seat, the covering of the Ark of the Covenant, that our unholiness and our sins have been covered. That is why in the New Testament, in Romans 3, 1 John 2 and 4, it says that Jesus is our propitiation. That's the same word as the mercy seat in the book of Exodus. It's the same word, mercy seat. Jesus is the mercy seat. He's the one who received the wrath and the judgment of God in our place so that we might be able to respond with joy and gratitude. One final thought. David was wearing a linen ephod. And you say, wait a minute, wasn't that just for the priest? What's he doing? He's a king. He's not supposed to be wearing that. Actually, the law of Moses doesn't prohibit any of this. So we just kind of know this to be the case, that that's normally what happens. But so the ephod is an overgarment. It's like a sleeveless, right? Could you see David, right, looking like an Old Testament ancient Marlon Brando or something like that? He's just kind of like James Dean, not too old. Okay, whoever is cool and hip. Now, so it's a sleeveless garment. And his wife, actually she's not even referred to as his wife, it says the daughter of Saul, which the narrator is trying to make very clear that she comes from the household of Saul, and what's happening here with David is utterly different. And she says, what are you doing? You're revealing yourself, and you're kind of like letting everyone see you. You're the king, for Pete's sake. What are you doing? Why are you exposing yourself this way? And by the way, people have assumed, he just went down to his undergarments and he's completely exposing himself. I don't believe that's what happened. I think he was just wearing this sleeveless ephod. And why is that significant? Because what he's trying to say is, I am not the ultimate king. He was not going in with his royal robes and saying, here it is. The king is arriving. Everyone know I am David. I'm the successor to Saul. He's saying, no, I'm going to wear the vestments of a servant, like a priest, so that everyone will know the true king is right here. The real king is right here. My authority is delegated. I'm not the true king. I'm not the true ruler and the Lord of my own life. And a holy God is coming, and the beautiful thing about this holy God is that he got a glimpse of this. I don't know how he fully understood this, but for us, when we see Jesus, who is the fulfillment of the ark, who is the fulfillment of the mercy seat, the one who is the ultimate sacrifice, when he comes and he rules over our lives, we are saying that I can now defer myself. I can be the pronoun. I can refer back to the one who rules over my life, and I will submit myself knowing that even though he's holy and I'm holy, holiness is contagious because of what he has accomplished on the cross for me. And you know what that does for me? It gives me rest. And at the same time, it does not make me lose a sense of wonder. One Princeton theologian by the name of B.B. Warfield has said in an essay entitled Dynamic of Familiarity, familiarity is that he said that sometimes when we come close to divine things, like many of you who grew up in the church, be mindful of this. When you come close to divine things, read the Bible, come, spend time with other Christians, pray, all wonderful things and necessary things, that can cause you to lose your sense of wonder. That's kind of ironic, right? It's because it's just kind of assumed. Oh, this is what we do. And it's most dangerous for people like me, a professional teacher, a theologian who teaches the Bible. By the grace of God, I have spent years and years studying the Bible. And so I'd be like, yeah, sure. I know the Bible. I know these doctrines. I know these doctrines, but I don't really know these doctrines. It just becomes too familiar. Like God's holiness is just assumed. I'll just kind of reach out my hand. I'm not that unholy. God, I've invested so many hours for you. And my encouragement to you would be that when you are confronted with the holiness of God, know that you will not be consumed. You will not be destroyed because of what Jesus has done. He's the perfect mercy seat. He's the sacrifice. He provided a way. But it will free you up to not to rule your life. It will free you up to give praise to God like David. He said, his wife is saying, look at you, embarrassing yourself. Why did she say that? Because she grew up in the palace. She was the daughter of Saul, King Saul. And then God closed her womb. Do you know why? Because I don't have time to talk about that because you might be thinking, oh my goodness, he closed someone's womb. He did that because he wants to show that his future heir of the Messiah to come will come through a common woman. Her name was Bathsheba. That's the way God works. He exalts the humble and he puts down the proud. And he is saying that you ought not to view yourself, don't have an overinflated view of yourself. Know that you're just a servant to do my work. I've given you access. Find rest in that. Find confidence in that. Don't lose your sense of awe and wonder. Let's pray.